Hey everyone. Tonight we delve into one of the most tragic and terrifying tales in all of Star Wars lore. The complete story of Exar Kun, a brilliant Jedi who became something far more dangerous than any Sith Lord who came before him. A young seeker of knowledge whose thirst for forbidden wisdom would ignite a war that nearly consumed the galaxy itself. This is the story of how a promising apprentice discovered ancient secrets that should have remained buried, how he unlocked powers that transformed him into a being of pure malevolence, and how his spirit became trapped for eternity within the haunted temples of Yavin 4. Now, if you enjoy these deep dives into Star Wars mythology, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. I notice that about 86% of you watching haven't subscribed yet, and your support really helps me continue creating these immersive stories for you. Also, if you're interested in exploring even more Star Wars lore and galactic mysteries, I've recently launched a new channel called Loreverse, and I've added the link in the description below. I'd love to hear from you in the comments about where you're listening from tonight and what time it is in your corner of the galaxy. There's something truly wonderful about knowing we're all sharing this journey together, no matter how far apart we are. Now, get comfortable, dim those lights, and let's begin with a glimpse of what's to come. 4,000 years before Luke Skywalker ever set foot on Yavin 4, something ancient and hungry stirred within those same jungle temples, deep beneath layers of stone and shadow. A consciousness that had transcended death itself began to whisper. The spirit of Exar Kun, once the most feared Dark Lord of the Sith, sensed a disturbance in the Force. A young Jedi had arrived on his prison world, and with him came an opportunity that Kun had waited millennia to seize. But how did this brilliant young Jedi become such a creature of darkness? What forbidden knowledge did he uncover that made him more powerful and more dangerous than Darth Vader, more cunning than Emperor Palpatine himself? And what terrible price did he pay for his quest to unlock the deepest mysteries of the Force? Tonight, you'll discover the complete truth behind Exar Kun's transformation from promising apprentice to galactic destroyer. You'll witness his first steps into darkness, his discovery of ancient Sith magic, and the catastrophic war that followed. Most importantly, you'll learn why his story serves as the ultimate warning about the seductive power of forbidden knowledge and the eternal hunger that lies at the heart of the dark side. The tale begins 4,000 years ago, in an age when the Jedi Order stood at the height of its power, and one young man's curiosity would change the fate of the galaxy forever. 4,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, the galaxy existed in what historians would later call the Golden Age of the Old Republic. This was an era when the Jedi Order commanded respect across 1,000 star systems, when the Republic Senate held sway over countless worlds, and when the ancient evils of the Sith seemed like distant nightmares from a forgotten past. On the peaceful world of Dantooine, where rolling grasslands stretched beneath twin suns and ancient ruins whispered of civilizations lost to time, the Jedi had established one of their most revered training enclaves. Here, among crystalline caves that hummed with natural force energy, promising young apprentices learned to channel their abilities under the guidance of wise masters who had spent centuries perfecting their understanding of the light side. The air on Dantooine carried a unique quality that seemed to amplify force sensitivity. Students would often speak of how the very atmosphere felt alive, charged with an energy that made meditation deeper and more profound. The grass moved in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, responding to the emotional states of those who walked among the training grounds. Even the native Kinrath that dwelled in the crystal caves appeared more docile here, as if the overwhelming presence of light-side energy pacified their normally aggressive nature. It was in this sanctuary of learning and contemplation that a young human named Exar Kun first began to distinguish himself among his fellow apprentices. Even as a child, Kun possessed an intensity that set him apart from his peers. His eyes held a keen intelligence that seemed to pierce through complexity and reach the heart of any problem. When he spoke, Others listened, drawn by a natural charisma that made his words carry weight beyond his years. Kun's physical presence was equally commanding, tall and lean, with dark hair that caught the light of Dantooine's suns. He moved with a fluid grace that spoke of exceptional coordination and natural athletic ability. His hands, already skilled in the construction of training sabers, showed the steady precision of someone destined for greatness in the Jedi arts. But it was Kun's connection to the Force that truly marked him as extraordinary. During meditation sessions in the crystal caves, other students would often pause in their own practice simply to observe the way energy seemed to flow around him. The Force crystals embedded in the cavern walls would pulse with brighter light when he entered deep states of concentration, as if responding to some inner fire that burned within his spirit. His master, Vodo Siusk Bada, was among the most respected teachers in the Jedi Order. This ancient being, whose species had lived for centuries longer than humans, possessed wisdom accumulated over millennia of study and practice. Badas walked with the aid of a gnarled staff, not from physical weakness, but as a symbol of his connection to the living force that flowed through all natural things. His eyes, deep and knowing, had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, and in them students could glimpse depths of understanding that took lifetimes to acquire. Under Basi's patient guidance, Kun excelled in every aspect of his training. His lightsaber technique developed with remarkable speed, combining traditional forms with innovative approaches that surprised even veteran instructors. Yet Master Baes, for all his pride in his promising apprentice, began to notice troubling undercurrents in Kun's development. During their private conversations, the young man would ask probing questions about the nature of the Force itself, pushing beyond the comfortable boundaries of light-side philosophy into territories that made his master uneasy. Kun possessed an insatiable curiosity about the mechanisms of power, the theoretical limits of Force abilities, and most concerning of all, the historical records of those who had fallen to the dark side. The training grounds of Dantooine were designed to foster harmony and balance, with meditation gardens where students could lose themselves in the contemplation of flowing water and carefully tended plants. But Kun often found himself drawn to the more isolated areas of the enclave, particularly the restricted archives where the most sensitive historical documents were kept under careful guard. He would spend hours poring over fragments of ancient texts, his brilliant mind piecing together incomplete records with a dedication that bordered on obsession. Other students began to notice subtle changes in their accomplished peer. While Kun remained outwardly friendly and supportive, there were moments when his expressions would shift, revealing glimpses of an inner intensity that seemed almost predatory. During sparring sessions, his techniques became more aggressive, pushing the boundaries of what was considered appropriate for training exercises. Some of his fellow apprentices reported feeling genuinely unsettled after facing him in practice duels, though they struggled to articulate exactly what had changed. The Force itself seemed to respond differently to Kun's presence as his training progressed. The same crystal caves that had once pulsed with serene light during his meditations began to exhibit more chaotic patterns when he practiced there alone. Instructors would occasionally find training equipment damaged after Kun's solo sessions, twisted in ways that suggested forces far beyond what a student should have been able to generate. Master Baes watched these developments with growing concern, recognizing in his gifted apprentice the same dangerous potential that had led so many promising Jedi astray throughout history. The old master had lived long enough to understand that exceptional ability, when combined with unchecked ambition, could become a pathway to catastrophe. In quiet moments he would gaze out across Dantooine's peaceful grasslands and wonder if he was witnessing the early stages of another fall from grace, another brilliant light about to be consumed by its own intensity. The stage was set for a tragedy that would echo across the millennia, and at its center stood a young man whose quest for knowledge would soon transform him into something far more terrible than anyone could imagine. The transformation of Exar Kun from promising apprentice to galactic threat began not with a single moment of corruption, but with a gradual awakening of ambitions that would prove impossible to contain. During advanced lightsaber training sessions, Kun would effortlessly defeat opponents who had been studying for years longer than he had. His blade work combined precision with an innovative flair that left instructors both impressed and slightly unnerved. Where other students focused on perfecting classical forms, Kun seemed to instinctively understand how to adapt and evolve techniques in real time, creating hybrid styles that were uniquely his own. His mastery extended beyond mere physical skill to an almost supernatural ability to predict his opponent's moves, as if he could read their intentions through the Force itself. Yet it was in the realm of Force sensing that Kun's abilities truly set him apart from his peers. He possessed an uncanny knack for perceiving the emotional undercurrents of those around him, reading subtle shifts in mood and motivation that escaped others entirely. This gift allowed him to navigate social situations with remarkable effectiveness, but it also exposed him to the darker thoughts and feelings that most Jedi learn to shield themselves from experiencing. The restricted archives of the Dantooine enclave became Kun's favorite retreat as he grew increasingly hungry for knowledge that went beyond standard curriculum. These ancient repositories contained fragments of historical records that stretched back thousands of years, including carefully preserved accounts of conflicts that the modern Jedi Order preferred not to discuss in detail. Here, among dusty holocrons and crumbling manuscripts, Kun first encountered references to the Sith Lords of antiquity. The initial fragments he discovered were heavily redacted, with entire passages removed or obscured by official censors who had deemed the information too dangerous for general study. These gaps in knowledge only served to inflame Kun's curiosity further. He began to piece together incomplete histories like a scholar working on an ancient puzzle, using his analytical mind to fill in missing details and reconstruct narratives that had been deliberately suppressed. Master Bass began to notice his apprentices' nocturnal research habits during their regular morning discussions. The old Jedi had lived long enough to recognize the signs of a student becoming too focused on acquiring power rather than understanding wisdom. He attempted to redirect Kun's interests toward more traditional areas of study, assigning him meditation exercises designed to promote humility and patience. But these efforts only seemed to deepen Kun's conviction that his teachers were holding him back from his true potential. During philosophical debates with other students, he would argue passionately that the Jedi Order's conservative approach to knowledge was ultimately counterproductive. How could they effectively combat darkness, he reasoned, if they refused to understand it thoroughly? How could they protect the galaxy from threats they were forbidden to study? These arguments carried a persuasive logic that appealed to several of his fellow students, particularly those who, like Kun, felt constrained by the pace of traditional training. A small group began to gather around him, drawn by his charismatic confidence and his willingness to question established doctrine. They would meet in secluded areas of the enclave, discussing theoretical approaches to force mastery that went well beyond anything taught in formal classes. The influence of these discussions began to manifest in subtle changes throughout the training community. Students who had previously accepted their instructor's guidance without question started to challenge assignments and request access to more advanced materials. The harmonious atmosphere that had long characterized the Dantooine enclave began to show signs of strain as traditional authority structures came under scrutiny. Kun's growing reputation as an intellectual leader coincided with an increasing boldness in his personal research methods. He began to experiment with techniques for accessing restricted holocrons, using his advanced force abilities to bypass security measures that had been designed to prevent unauthorized access. Each success in these endeavors only reinforced his belief that the limitations placed on his learning were arbitrary and unnecessary. The content he discovered through these illicit investigations proved to be far more disturbing than anything he had previously encountered. Ancient Sith texts spoke of power that transcended the normal boundaries of life and death, of techniques that could reshape reality itself according to the will of the practitioner. The philosophical frameworks described in these documents presented compelling alternatives to traditional Jedi teachings, offering paths to strength that seemed far more direct and effective than the patient, gradual approach favored by the light side. Master Baze grew increasingly troubled by the changes he observed in his apprentice. Kun's exceptional abilities continued to develop at an unprecedented rate, but they were accompanied by a growing arrogance and a disturbing lack of respect for the wisdom of previous generations. The young man seemed to believe that his natural talents exempted him from the careful progression that had guided Jedi training for millennia. The philosophical conversations between master and student became more frequent and more intense as Baze attempted to address what he saw as dangerous trends in Kun's thinking. But Kun had developed compelling counterarguments to every point his master raised. He questioned whether the Jedi Order's caution was truly based on wisdom or simply on fear of change. He argued that exceptional individuals might require exceptional approaches to training, and that rigid adherence to tradition could prevent the Order from reaching its full potential. Most troubling of all, he began to suggest that the Jedi's historical failures might be attributed to their unwillingness to embrace all aspects of the Force. These debates revealed a fundamental philosophical divide that seemed to grow wider with each passing discussion. Where Baze saw the value of established wisdom and the importance of learning from past mistakes, Kun saw stagnation and missed opportunities. Where the master emphasized the dangers of unchecked ambition, the student perceived the limitations of excessive caution. The breaking point came when Kun openly challenged one of the Order's most fundamental principles during a public discussion session. He argued that the traditional distinction between light and dark sides of the Force was an artificial construct that prevented Jedi from achieving their full potential. True mastery, he suggested, required understanding and utilizing all aspects of the Force, not just those deemed acceptable by conservative teachings. This heretical position sent shockwaves through the Dantooine enclave, dividing students and instructors alike. Some were scandalized by what they saw as dangerous thinking that echoed the justifications used by fallen Jedi throughout history. Others, particularly among the younger apprentices, found themselves intrigued by Kun's bold reimagining of fundamental concepts. Master Baze recognized that his apprentice had reached a crucial turning point. The young man's exceptional abilities, combined with his growing obsession with forbidden knowledge, had created a volatile combination that threatened not only his own future, but potentially the stability of the entire training community. The old Jedi faced the most difficult decision of his long career, knowing that whatever choice he made would have consequences that extended far beyond their personal relationship. The seeds of galactic catastrophe had been planted in the mind of a brilliant young student whose hunger for knowledge had begun to eclipse his capacity for wisdom. On Dantooine, where the Force flowed with unusual clarity and strength, the darkness that would eventually consume Exar Kun first began to take root, hidden beneath layers of intellectual curiosity and righteous ambition that made its true nature almost impossible to detect until it was far too late to prevent the tragedy that would follow. The ancient corridors of the Jedi Temple on Coruscant had witnessed countless pilgrims seeking wisdom throughout the millennia, but few had arrived with the burning intensity that characterized Exar Kun's quest for forbidden knowledge. Having exhausted the limited resources available on Dantooine, and growing increasingly frustrated with what he perceived as his master's unwillingness to facilitate his advanced studies, Kun had convinced the Council to grant him access to the vast archives housed within the galaxy's most sacred repository of Jedi learning. The journey to the galactic capital marked a significant escalation in Kun's pursuit of understanding. Where Dantooine had offered only fragments and tantalizing glimpses of suppressed history, Coruscant promised access to the most comprehensive collection of Force-related knowledge in existence. The temple's archives stretched deep beneath the surface of the planet, their lowest levels containing materials so ancient and sensitive that few Jedi had ever been permitted to study them directly. Kun approached these archives with the methodical dedication of a scholar, but his research methods revealed an obsession that went far beyond academic curiosity. He would arrive at the earliest permissible hour and remain until the archivists were forced to close the chambers for mandatory rest periods. The deeper archives contained holographic records of testimonies given by Jedi who had encountered Sith artifacts and survived to report their experiences. These accounts, preserved in excruciating detail, described the psychological effects of exposure to dark side influences with a clinical precision that made them far more disturbing than the sanitized versions included in standard historical texts. Kun found himself drawn to these testimonies with an intensity that should have served as a warning about his own susceptibility to the very influences they described. Among the most significant discoveries in his research were references to Naga Sadow, the ancient Dark Lord whose manipulations had precipitated the Great Hyperspace War centuries earlier. The official histories dismissed Sadow as a megalomaniac whose ambitions had ultimately led to his own destruction. Kun became particularly fascinated by accounts of Sadow's ability to manipulate matter on a molecular level, creating illusions so convincing that they could fool not only sentient observers but also sophisticated scanning equipment. These techniques seemed to represent a fundamental breakthrough in force application that went far beyond anything taught in contemporary training programs. The theoretical implications were staggering, suggesting possibilities for power that could reshape the very fabric of reality. His research into these advanced techniques led him to seek out other students who shared his interest in pushing beyond conventional boundaries. He found willing collaborators among several promising apprentices who had grown similarly frustrated with the conservative pace of traditional training. These young Jedi brought their own areas of expertise to their informal study group, creating a collaborative environment that accelerated everyone's learning at a rate that concerned their respective masters. The group's meetings took place in unused chambers deep within the temple, locations chosen specifically for their isolation from regular foot traffic and potential oversight. Here they would pool their research findings and engage in theoretical discussions that explored the practical applications of techniques that were barely mentioned in approved curriculum. The intellectual stimulation of these gatherings proved addictive for participants who had spent years feeling intellectually constrained by conventional studies. As their understanding deepened, the group began to experiment with practical applications of the theories they had been studying. Initial attempts focused on relatively simple manipulations, testing their ability to influence objects and energy fields in ways that went beyond standard telekinetic exercises. These early successes encouraged them to attempt increasingly ambitious projects, each achievement building confidence that they were on the verge of revolutionary breakthroughs. The most significant breakthrough came when Kun successfully accessed a holocron that had been sealed with multiple layers of security designed to prevent unauthorized activation. The device contained fragmentary records of an ancient Sith Lord whose name had been deliberately erased from most historical accounts, but whose techniques for binding consciousness to physical objects were described in sufficient detail to provide a foundation for further research. This discovery represented a watershed moment in Kun's development, marking his first direct contact with pure Sith knowledge, rather than the filtered and interpreted versions available through official channels. The holocron's gatekeeper, a spectral image of its long-dead creator, spoke with a persuasive eloquence that presented dark side techniques as natural extensions of force mastery, rather than corrupting influences to be avoided. The psychological impact of this encounter was profound and immediate. The Khan found himself experiencing vivid dreams filled with images of ancient civilizations and forgotten powers that seemed more real than his waking experiences. These visions provided additional information that complemented what he had learned from the holocron, creating a comprehensive picture of Sith capabilities that far exceeded anything he had previously imagined possible. His collaborators noticed significant changes in Kun's demeanor following his success with the sealed holocron, where he had previously been enthusiastic but collegial in his approach to their shared research. He began to exhibit a more possessive attitude toward the knowledge they were uncovering. He would often disappear for hours at a time, claiming to be pursuing individual research projects that he was not yet ready to share with the group. These solo investigations led Kun deeper into the most restricted areas of the archives, where materials were stored that had been deemed too dangerous for any but the most senior Jedi Masters to examine. His growing abilities allowed him to bypass security measures that would have stopped less talented intruders, and his intellectual brilliance enabled him to interpret texts that were deliberately written in obscure formats designed to discourage casual study. The content of these deepest archives confirmed many of the theories that Kun and his collaborators had been developing independently. Ancient Sith Lords had indeed achieved levels of power that transcended normal understanding of Force capabilities, creating techniques that could manipulate not only physical matter, but also the fundamental forces that govern space and time. The potential applications were limitless, suggesting possibilities for achievements that could benefit the entire galaxy if properly understood and controlled. Yet embedded within these tantalizing descriptions were subtle warnings about the psychological costs associated with such power. The texts described transformation processes that fundamentally altered the consciousness of practitioners, replacing human emotions and motivations with alien priorities that normal minds could barely comprehend. These warnings were presented in language so archaic and metaphorical that their true meaning was easily overlooked by researchers focused on the practical applications being described. Kun's interpretation of these cautionary passages was heavily influenced by his growing conviction that traditional Jedi teachings were based on unnecessary fear rather than genuine wisdom. He came to view the warnings as propaganda designed to discourage investigation of techniques that could revolutionize the Order's effectiveness. From his perspective, the risks described were acceptable prices to pay for the kind of power that could protect the galaxy from threats that conventional approaches could never hope to address. The most disturbing aspect of Kun's research during this period was his discovery of references to living Sith spirits that had supposedly survived the destruction of their physical forms through the use of techniques that bound their consciousness to specific locations or objects. These accounts described encounters with entities that possessed vast knowledge and were allegedly willing to share their secrets with worthy students who demonstrated sufficient dedication and capability. The implications of these discoveries filled Kun with an excitement that bordered on obsession. If such beings truly existed, they would represent the ultimate sources of advanced knowledge. Teachers who could provide instruction that went far beyond anything available through conventional channels. The possibility of making contact with these ancient masters became the focus of increasingly elaborate research projects designed to locate the specific sites or artifacts that served as their anchors to the physical world. His investigation into these matters led him to compile detailed maps of locations throughout the galaxy, where significant Sith activities had been recorded in historical accounts. The most intriguing of these locations was Korriban, the ancient homeworld of the Sith species, and the site of elaborate tomb complexes that had housed the greatest Dark Lords throughout history. According to the fragmentary accounts available in the deepest archives, these burial sites contained not only material artifacts, but also spiritual presences that continued to influence the physical world centuries after their creators' deaths. As Kun's research progressed, his relationships with his fellow students and instructors began to deteriorate noticeably. His growing obsession with forbidden knowledge made him increasingly impatient with routine training exercises and philosophical discussions that seemed trivial compared to the revolutionary concepts he was exploring independently. Masters who had previously admired his intellectual gifts began to express concerns about the direction his studies were taking and the potential consequences of his fascination with dangerous historical precedents. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would force Kun to choose between the security of conventional wisdom and the intoxicating promise of unlimited power, a decision that would ultimately determine not only his own fate but the destiny of the entire galaxy. The red sands of Korriban stretched endlessly beneath a crimson sky that seemed perpetually stained with the blood of ancient conflicts, creating an otherworldly landscape that felt fundamentally hostile to life itself. This desolate world, once the thriving homeworld of the original Sith species, now served as a massive necropolis where the greatest Dark Lords of history lay entombed within elaborate complexes that dotted the Valley of the Dark Lords like monuments to forgotten ambitions. Exar Kun's arrival on this cursed world marked a point of no return in his journey toward darkness, though at the time he convinced himself that his mission was purely academic. The young Jedi had traveled here alone, having finally abandoned all pretense of seeking approval from his masters for his increasingly dangerous research. His ship touched down on the ancient landing platforms that had once welcomed pilgrims seeking dark wisdom, now cracked and weathered by millennia of neglect and the corrosive influence of concentrated dark side energy. The atmosphere itself seemed thick with malevolent presence, pressing against Kun's consciousness with an almost physical weight that made every breath feel labored and uncomfortable. The Force flowed differently here than anywhere he had previously experienced, tainted by centuries of Sith rituals and the accumulated hatred of beings whose power had transcended normal limitations. His initial explorations focused on the largest and most impressive of the ancient tombs, massive structures carved directly into the living rock of the valley walls. These monuments represented the final resting places of Sith Lords, whose names had become legendary even among their enemies, beings like Ajunta Pal, Tulak Horde, and Marka Ragnas, whose achievements in the manipulation of dark side power had never been equaled by subsequent generations. The tomb of Ajunta Pal, the first Dark Lord to bear the title of Darth, proved to be particularly rich in preserved knowledge. The burial chamber contained not only material artifacts, but also holographic records that documented the philosophical journey of a former Jedi who had rejected the limitations of light side training in favor of unlimited exploration of Force potential. These recordings presented Pal's transformation not as a fall from grace, but as an evolution toward a higher understanding of cosmic truth. Kun spent hours absorbing these testimonies, finding in them a sophisticated intellectual framework that seemed to validate many of his own criticisms of traditional Jedi doctrine. Pal's arguments were presented with the eloquence of a master philosopher, addressing common objections to dark side practices with logical rebuttals that were difficult to dismiss. The psychological impact of these encounters was profound and immediate. Kun began to experience the same sense of intellectual liberation that had characterized his initial discoveries in the Coruscant archives, but magnified to a degree that was almost overwhelming. The knowledge he was accessing here went far beyond theoretical discussions to provide practical instruction in techniques that could reshape reality according to the will of the practitioner. Yet even as he absorbed these dangerous teachings, Kun managed to maintain a facade of scholarly detachment that allowed him to rationalize his activities as legitimate research rather than corruption. He told himself that he was merely studying historical techniques in order to better understand the enemies that future Jedi might face. This self-deception proved remarkably durable, surviving even direct exposure to the most seductive aspects of Sith philosophy. Kun's attempts to replicate these techniques yielded immediate and dramatic results that far exceeded his expectations. The dark side energies that permeated Korriban responded to his efforts with an eagerness that should have served as a warning about the addictive nature of such power. Instead, each successful application only reinforced his growing conviction that traditional limitations were artificial constructs designed to prevent Jedi from reaching their true potential. The most disturbing aspect of his experiences in the valley was the gradual realization that he was not alone among the tombs. spectral presences seemed to observe his activities with approval, and he began to hear whispered voices offering encouragement and additional instruction. These encounters were subtle enough that he could dismiss them as products of the valley's oppressive atmosphere, but persistent enough to suggest that ancient intelligences continued to inhabit their burial sites. The tomb of Marka Ragnos proved to be the most significant discovery of Kun's pilgrimage to Korriban. This legendary Dark Lord had ruled the Sith Empire during its Golden Age, achieving a level of power and influence that had never been matched by subsequent rulers. His burial chamber contained artifacts that pulsed with barely contained energy, including weapons and meditation devices that seemed to respond to Kun's presence with an almost eager anticipation. Among the most important of these artifacts was a collection of Sith texts that had been preserved using techniques that maintained their legibility across millennia. These documents contain detailed instructions for advanced applications of dark side power, including methods for extending life indefinitely and techniques for transferring consciousness between different physical forms. The implications were staggering, suggesting possibilities for transcending the normal limitations of mortality through the application of sufficient knowledge and will. Kun's study of these materials was interrupted by increasingly frequent episodes of what he initially interpreted as Force visions, but which gradually revealed themselves to be direct communications from spiritual entities associated with the various tomb sites. These encounters began as vague impressions and emotional influences, but evolved into coherent conversations as Kun's sensitivity to dark side energies continued to increase through his ongoing exposure to concentrated Sith influences. Initially, Kun approached these encounters with appropriate skepticism, recognizing the possibility that he was experiencing psychological effects induced by prolonged exposure to dark side energies. However, the entities demonstrated knowledge of specific details about his research and personal history that would have been impossible for hallucinations to possess, gradually convincing him that he was indeed communicating with genuine spiritual presences. These ancient teachers proved to be far more sophisticated in their approach than the crude temptations that characterized most dark side influences. The spirits presented themselves as cosmic philosophers who had transcended the petty limitations that constrained ordinary beings, having achieved perspectives that encompassed truths too profound for conventional minds to grasp. They argued that traditional distinctions between good and evil were artifacts of limited understanding, claiming that true wisdom required the ability to utilize all available tools regardless of their conventional classifications. Under their guidance, Kun began to experiment with increasingly advanced applications of the techniques he had been studying, achieving results that confirmed the validity of their instruction, while simultaneously deepening his dependence on their continued support. Each success reinforced his growing belief that he had discovered a path to power that was fundamentally superior to anything offered by traditional Jedi training. The psychological transformation that accompanied these achievements was gradual but unmistakable. Kun's natural charisma evolved into something more commanding and intimidating, while his intellectual confidence developed edges of arrogance that had been absent from his earlier personality. Physical changes were also beginning to manifest, subtle alterations in his appearance that reflected the internal corruption taking root within his spirit. Most significantly, his connection to the light side of the Force began to weaken as his exposure to concentrated dark side energies continued. The techniques he was learning required practitioners to embrace emotions and motivations that were fundamentally incompatible with traditional Jedi philosophy, creating psychological conflicts that could only be resolved by abandoning one approach in favor of the other. The ancient spirits encouraged this process by presenting it as necessary evolution rather than corruption, arguing that Kun's growing power represented natural development toward a higher state of being. They claimed that his increasing alienation from conventional moral constraints was evidence of expanding consciousness rather than moral degradation, reframing every troubling change as positive progress toward ultimate enlightenment. By the time Kun departed Korriban, carrying with him a collection of artifacts and texts that would have horrified his former masters. The transformation from promising Jedi apprentice to potential Dark Lord was already well advanced. The seeds of corruption that had been planted during his research on Coruscant had found fertile ground in the concentrated darkness of the Sith homeworld, growing into convictions that would soon reshape his understanding of himself and his place in the galaxy. The transition from student to seeker marked a fundamental shift in Exar Kun's relationship with the Force itself, as he began to explore applications of power that existed far beyond the boundaries of conventional Jedi understanding. His return from Korriban had equipped him with knowledge that transformed his perspective on everything he had previously accepted as immutable truth, opening pathways to abilities that seemed to violate the basic laws governing reality. The artifacts he had acquired from the ancient tombs proved to be far more than simple historical curiosities. Each item pulsed with residual energy that responded to his growing dark side attunement, revealing hidden functions that had remained dormant for centuries while waiting for a practitioner capable of activating their true potential. The most significant of these was an ancient meditation sphere that had once belonged to Marka Ragnos himself, a device designed to amplify force sensitivity while simultaneously exposing the user to concentrated dark side influences. Kun's experiments with this sphere yielded results that exceeded even his elevated expectations. During meditation sessions, he found himself experiencing visions that seemed to transcend normal temporal boundaries, witnessing events from the distant past and catching glimpses of possible futures that stretched far beyond his natural lifespan. These experiences provided him with insights into the cyclical nature of galactic history, revealing patterns of rise and fall that suggested his own emergence as a significant force was not coincidental but inevitable. The visions revealed to him the existence of hidden Sith strongholds scattered throughout the galaxy, secret repositories of knowledge and power that had been concealed from both Jedi and Republic authorities for millennia. These locations had been established by ancient Dark Lords as insurance against the possibility of their empire's destruction, serving as seeds from which Sith influence could eventually regenerate even after apparent total defeat. One such location called to him with particular urgency, a jungle world designated in the ancient texts as Yavin 4, where a massive temple complex had been constructed using techniques that incorporated both advanced technology and sophisticated force manipulation. The records describe this site as the ultimate achievement of Sith architectural engineering, a facility designed to serve as a focal point for dark side energies drawn from across the galaxy. The prospect of accessing such a concentrated source of power proved irresistible to Kun's expanding ambitions. His studies had revealed that the techniques necessary for true mastery of Sith abilities required exposure to energy levels that could not be safely achieved through conventional meditation alone. The Yavin facility promised to provide the amplified force environment necessary for the advanced transformations he sought to undergo. Yet before embarking on this next phase of his journey, Kun recognized the need to consolidate and expand upon the knowledge he had already acquired. The fragments of Sith philosophy he had absorbed from various sources needed to be integrated into a coherent worldview that could guide his future development. This process of synthesis led him to develop his own interpretation of dark side principles, one that emphasized intellectual superiority and cosmic destiny rather than crude emotional manipulation. This intellectual framework provided Kun with the justification he needed to pursue increasingly extreme applications of Sith techniques without experiencing the guilt or hesitation that might have constrained a less thoroughly indoctrinated practitioner. Each successful experiment in power manipulation reinforced his conviction that he was following a path of enlightenment rather than corruption, making it progressively easier to abandon constraints that he now viewed as obstacles to necessary evolution. The physical transformation that accompanied his psychological development became more pronounced as his exposure to concentrated dark side energies continued. His natural attractiveness evolved into something more commanding and slightly predatory, while his eyes began to reflect depths of knowledge that seemed almost alien in their intensity. These changes enhanced rather than diminished his charismatic appeal, making him even more persuasive when interacting with others who might be recruited to support his growing ambitions. Among the most significant of these potential allies were several former colleagues from his time studying on Coruscant, young Jedi who had shared his frustration with conventional limitations and who remained receptive to alternative approaches to Force mastery. Corran's enhanced abilities allowed him to sense their underlying dissatisfaction with traditional training, making it possible for him to approach them with carefully crafted arguments designed to exploit their specific vulnerabilities. The success of these recruitment efforts provided Kun with the beginnings of an organization that could support his increasingly ambitious projects. Each new convert brought additional skills and resources to the growing conspiracy, while their continued participation in conventional Jedi activities provided valuable intelligence about potential obstacles to his plans. More importantly, the process of teaching others helped Kun refine his own understanding of the principles he was advocating. The necessity of explaining complex philosophical concepts in terms that others could accept forced him to develop more sophisticated justifications for his methods, creating a comprehensive ideological framework that could withstand careful scrutiny by intelligent critics. This framework emphasized the concept of necessary evolution, arguing that the galaxy faced threats that could only be addressed through the application of powers that transcended conventional moral limitations. Traditional Jedi approaches, according to this analysis, were fundamentally inadequate for dealing with challenges that required total commitment and unrestricted access to all available resources. The ancient Sith Lords, from this perspective, had not been villains seeking personal gratification, but visionary leaders who understood the necessity of embracing difficult truths for the greater good. Their techniques represented practical solutions to cosmic problems rather than expressions of moral corruption, making their study and application not only acceptable but morally imperative for anyone serious about protecting galactic civilization. This reinterpretation of Sith history proved particularly effective when presented to individuals who had already begun to question conventional assumptions about good and evil. Kun's natural eloquence, enhanced by his growing command of force-based persuasion techniques, made him capable of presenting even the most questionable concepts in terms that seemed not only reasonable but urgently necessary. The growing network of converts provided Kun with access to resources that would have been impossible to obtain through individual effort alone. Hidden supporters within the Jedi Order could provide advance warning of potential investigations, while sympathizers in other organizations offered funding and logistical support for increasingly elaborate research projects. Most significantly, this expanding base of support made it possible for Kun to begin preparing for the ultimate test of his theories. The journey to Yavin 4 and the attempt to access the concentrated dark side energies that ancient records suggested were available there. As the appointed time approached, Kun found himself experiencing an anticipation that bordered on euphoria. The culmination of all his research and experimentation lay within reach, promising to elevate him to a level of power that would make him the equal of the greatest Sith Lords in history. The boy who had begun this journey as a curious student seeking knowledge had evolved into something far more dangerous, a being whose ambitions now encompassed the fundamental restructuring of galactic civilization according to principles that most minds would find incomprehensible. The moon-drenched jungles of Onderon held secrets that had remained hidden for 4 centuries, buried beneath layers of political intrigue and royal succession that masked the true source of the world's recurring darkness. It was here, among the ancient burial grounds of the Onderonian monarchs, that Exar Kun would encounter the most significant mentor of his transformation, a being whose influence would prove far more direct and personal than the distant whispers he had experienced in the tombs of Korriban. Kun's arrival on Onderon had been guided by cryptic references discovered in the deepest archives of Yavin 4, fragments that suggested the presence of a powerful force entity capable of providing instruction in the advanced techniques he sought to master. The jungle moon's oppressive atmosphere was saturated with dark side energy that seemed to pulse with malevolent intelligence, creating an environment where the boundaries between the living and the dead became increasingly unclear. At the heart of this labyrinthine complex lay the most elaborate tomb of all, a massive chamber dedicated to preserving the remains and legacy of Freedon Nadd, the former Jedi who had become one of the most feared Sith Lords in galactic history. Unlike the ancient spirits of Korriban, whose presence felt distant and impersonal, Nadd's consciousness radiated an immediacy and focus that suggested active intelligence rather than mere residual energy. The initial contact between Kun and Nadd's spirit occurred during a meditation session conducted within the burial chamber itself, as the young seeker attempted to access the knowledge contained within the elaborate sarcophagus that dominated the room. The experience began as a subtle shift in the ambient force energy, gradually intensifying until Kun found himself face to face with a spectral figure whose presence filled the chamber with an aura of barely contained power. Nadd's spirit manifested with a clarity and definition that exceeded anything Kun had previously encountered, appearing as a tall, imposing figure whose ethereal form retained all the commanding presence that had characterized his physical existence. The ancient Sith Lord's eyes burned with an intelligence that seemed to pierce through every attempt at concealment, reading the depths of Kun's ambitions and desires with an accuracy that was both thrilling and deeply unsettling. The conversation that followed would prove to be the most significant turning point in Kun's entire journey toward darkness, as Nadd presented himself not as a corrupting influence, but as a guide whose wisdom could help a worthy student achieve his full potential. The ancient spirit's approach was sophisticated and seductive, addressing Kun's genuine intellectual interests while gradually introducing concepts that would fundamentally reshape his understanding of power and responsibility. And Nadd revealed that his consciousness had been deliberately preserved through techniques that went far beyond mere spiritual persistence, representing a true transcendence of the normal limitations imposed by physical death. This achievement had been accomplished through the application of Sith alchemy combined with advanced force manipulation, creating a state of existence that retained all the advantages of life while eliminating its inherent vulnerabilities. The implications of this revelation were staggering, suggesting possibilities for immortality that could allow a sufficiently skilled practitioner to accumulate knowledge and power across unlimited spans of time. Nadd claimed that this technique represented the ultimate goal of all serious Sith study, the final achievement that separated true masters from mere practitioners of advanced techniques. Under Nadd's guidance, Kun began to understand that his previous accomplishments, impressive as they had seemed, represented only the most preliminary stages of genuine Sith development. The ancient spirit revealed the existence of entire categories of power that remained completely unknown to contemporary force users, techniques that could reshape reality on scales that encompassed entire star systems or even galactic regions. These revelations were accompanied by practical instruction in methods that demonstrated the validity of Nadd's claims through immediate, tangible results. The spirit taught Kun techniques for manipulating matter at the molecular level, creating permanent alterations in physical objects that persisted long after the initial application of force energy. These exercises served as proof of concept for far more ambitious applications that could theoretically affect living beings or even planetary environments. The relationship that developed between mentor and student during this period was unlike anything Kun had previously experienced, combining the intellectual stimulation of advanced learning with a personal connection that seemed to transcend the normal boundaries between separate consciousnesses. Nadd's spirit appeared to take genuine pleasure in sharing knowledge with someone capable of appreciating its full significance, creating an atmosphere of collaboration rather than simple instruction. Yet beneath this facade of mutual benefit lay a far more complex dynamic that Kun was not yet sophisticated enough to fully recognize. Nadd's apparent generosity in sharing knowledge served purposes that extended far beyond simple educational altruism, representing instead a carefully orchestrated process designed to create psychological dependence, while gradually eroding the moral constraints that might otherwise limit his students' willingness to embrace extreme methods. The ancient spirit's approach to corruption was masterful in its subtlety, never directly advocating for obviously evil actions, but instead presenting increasingly questionable choices as logical extensions of principles that Kun had already accepted. Each step in this progression seemed reasonable when viewed in isolation, making it extremely difficult for the student to recognize the cumulative effect of decisions that were individually defensible but collectively transformative. Nadd revealed that Kun's exceptional natural abilities had been recognized and monitored by various Sith spirits for years before their first direct contact, suggesting that his emergence as a significant dark side practitioner was not coincidental but rather the result of careful cultivation by entities whose influence operated across vast spans of time. This revelation reframed Kun's entire personal history, presenting his journey toward darkness as the fulfillment of destiny rather than a series of personal choices. The psychological impact of this reinterpretation was profound, simultaneously inflating Kun's sense of his own importance while diminishing his perception of personal responsibility for the consequences of his actions. If his transformation had been inevitable from the beginning, then attempts to resist or modify his development would be not only futile but actively counterproductive to the fulfillment of cosmic purpose. Under Nadd's tutelage, Kun began to experiment with techniques that required him to draw upon emotional states that were fundamentally incompatible with traditional Jedi training. These exercises in emotional manipulation proved to be among the most seductive aspects of Nadd's instruction, as they provided immediate access to levels of power that far exceeded anything Kun could achieve through conventional meditation. The intoxicating rush of unrestricted force channeling created a psychological addiction that made it increasingly difficult to return to the limited approaches he had previously employed. The physical transformation that accompanied these advanced techniques became more pronounced as Kun's training under Nadd's guidance progressed. His natural charisma evolved into something more commanding and slightly intimidating, while his eyes began to reflect depths of knowledge that seemed to burn with inner fire. These changes enhanced his ability to influence others while simultaneously making it more difficult for him to form genuine emotional connections with beings who had not undergone similar transformations. Most significantly, Nadd began to prepare Kun for the final phase of his development, the journey to Yavin 4 and the attempt to access the concentrated dark side energies contained within the ancient Massassi temples. The spirit revealed that these facilities had been specifically designed to facilitate the kind of ultimate transformation that would elevate a skilled practitioner to the level of true Sith mastery. The process would be dangerous, requiring Kun to risk not only his physical existence, but also his fundamental identity, as the energies involved would reshape him on levels that transcended mere psychological change. Yet Nadd presented these risks as acceptable prices to pay for achieving a state of being that would make him effectively immortal and virtually omnipotent within his sphere of influence. As their time together drew toward its conclusion, Nadd's spirit began to fade from active manifestation, explaining that the energy required to maintain direct communication across the boundary between life and death was ultimately finite, even for beings who had achieved spiritual persistence. However, he assured Kun that their connection would endure, providing guidance and support during the critical trials that lay ahead on Yavin 4 and beyond. The emerald canopy of Yavin 4 stretched endlessly beneath alien constellations, concealing within its depths architectural marvels that predated known galactic civilization by countless millennia. These ancient Massassi temples represented the pinnacle of Sith engineering achievement, massive stone pyramids that had been constructed not merely as monuments, but as sophisticated machinery designed to channel and amplify dark side energies on a scale that defied conventional understanding of force manipulation. Kong's approach to the primary temple complex filled him with a mixture of anticipation and reverence that bordered on religious ecstasy. The structures rose from the jungle floor like artificial mountains, their precisely carved surfaces inscribed with hieroglyphs that seemed to shift and writhe when observed directly. The very air around these monuments thrummed with barely contained power, creating an atmosphere so charged with dark side energy that ordinary beings would have found it physically uncomfortable to remain in the vicinity for extended periods. The Massassi warriors who had constructed these temples under Sith direction had been more than mere laborers, representing a species whose natural force sensitivity had been deliberately enhanced through alchemical processes that transformed them into living conduits for dark side energies. Their descendants still inhabited the jungle depths, existing in a state of primitive regression that concealed their true nature as guardians of knowledge too dangerous for lesser beings to access. These ancient protectors recognized Kun's presence immediately upon his arrival, emerging from hidden strongholds to observe the newcomer with a mixture of curiosity and instinctive reverence. His growing attunement to dark side forces had marked him as significant in ways that transcended normal force sensitivity, creating an aura of authority that the degenerate Massassi found irresistible to acknowledge. The primary temple's interior revealed chambers that had been carved with mathematical precision from solid stone, creating acoustic properties that amplified both sound and force energy in ways that transformed ordinary meditation into transcendent experience. The walls were adorned with murals depicting the history of Sith civilization, showing the rise and fall of empires that had spanned entire galactic regions during epochs when the current republic existed only as scattered primitive settlements. At the heart of the temple complex lay the focus chamber, a circular room dominated by an altar that had been carved from a single massive crystal whose internal structure channeled and concentrated dark side energies drawn from across the entire star system. This crystalline formation represented the ultimate achievement of Sith architectural engineering, a device capable of facilitating transformations that could fundamentally alter the nature of any being, brave or foolish enough to submit to its influence. Kong's initial experiments with the temple's power amplification systems yielded results that exceeded even his elevated expectations, allowing him to perform feats of force manipulation that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. Simple telekinetic exercises became demonstrations of power that could reshape the physical environment on massive scales, while his ability to influence living beings expanded to encompass entire populations simultaneously. Yet these preliminary achievements represented merely the surface level of the temple's true capabilities, serving as preparation for far more ambitious applications that would require him to undergo fundamental changes in his relationship with the Force itself. The ancient Sith Lords who had designed this facility had intended it to serve as a crucible for the creation of beings whose power transcended normal limitations through the complete integration of dark side energies into their essential nature. The transformation process began gradually, as Kun spent increasing amounts of time within the focus chamber, allowing the concentrated energies to saturate his consciousness while he meditated on the advanced techniques that Freedon Nadd's spirit had taught him. Each session brought subtle changes that accumulated over time, altering not only his force abilities, but also his fundamental perception of reality and his place within the cosmic order. More significantly, his voice acquired harmonics that resonated with force energy in ways that made his words unnaturally persuasive, allowing him to influence others through speech alone, in addition to the more direct applications of mental manipulation that he had previously employed. This enhancement of his natural charisma proved to be among the most practically useful of his developing abilities, making it possible for him to recruit followers and manipulate political situations with unprecedented effectiveness. The psychological changes that accompanied his physical transformation were even more profound, fundamentally altering his relationship with concepts like empathy, compassion, and moral responsibility. The artificial enhancement of his intellectual capabilities came at the cost of emotional connections that had previously grounded him in normal human experience, creating a perspective that was simultaneously more comprehensive and more detached than anything he had previously known. This evolution in consciousness was not experienced as loss, but rather as liberation from constraints that had previously limited his ability to perceive and manipulate the true underlying structures of reality. From his transformed perspective, the emotional attachments that governed ordinary beings appeared as weaknesses that prevented them from achieving their full potential, making it both natural and necessary for superior individuals to assume leadership roles that others were constitutionally incapable of fulfilling. The growing network of followers that gathered around Kun during this period represented a mixture of genuine converts who had been persuaded by his philosophy and individuals whose minds had been directly influenced through force manipulation. The distinction between these categories became increasingly irrelevant as his enhanced abilities made it possible to reshape consciousness itself, creating devoted supporters whose loyalty transcended normal psychological boundaries. These followers provided the foundation for increasingly ambitious projects that tested the limits of the temple's power amplification capabilities. Under Kun's direction, they participated in rituals that channeled dark side energies through multiple individuals simultaneously, creating effects that could influence events across interstellar distances and manipulate the fundamental forces that governed planetary systems. The success of these experiments convinced Kun that he had discovered techniques that could fundamentally alter the balance of power throughout the galaxy, making it possible for a sufficiently skilled practitioner to impose order on the chaos that characterized most aspects of galactic civilization. The traditional authorities that claimed to govern star systems and species appeared pathetically inadequate when compared to the concentrated will of a being who had transcended normal limitations through the complete mastery of force potential. Yet even as his power continued to expand, Kun became increasingly aware that his transformation was approaching a critical threshold beyond which there would be no possibility of return to his previous state of existence. The energies that he was channeling through his enhanced physiology were fundamentally incompatible with normal biological processes, creating changes that were irreversible on levels that transcended mere physical alteration. This realization filled him not with regret, but with exhilaration, as he recognized that the approaching transformation would elevate him to a state of being that was qualitatively different from anything that normal creatures could hope to achieve. The prospect of transcending the limitations that constrained ordinary existence appealed to ambitions that had grown far beyond anything that could be satisfied through conventional accomplishments. The ancient Massassi, who served as guardians of the temple complex, began to exhibit signs of increased agitation as Kun's transformation progressed. Their primitive consciousness, recognizing that the energies being channeled through their sacred site were approaching levels that had not been experienced since the original construction of the facility. Their behavior suggested that they retained genetic memories of previous occasions when beings had attempted to utilize the temple's full potential, experiences that had apparently left lasting impressions on their collective unconscious. The final stages of Kun's transformation required him to perform a ritual that would permanently bind his consciousness to the temple complex itself, creating a symbiotic relationship between his enhanced awareness and the crystalline matrix that served as the facility's power source. This process would grant him effective immortality while simultaneously anchoring his existence to a specific location, representing both the ultimate achievement of Sith alchemy and its most significant limitation. As the moment of final transformation approached, Kun experienced a clarity of purpose that eliminated any remaining doubts about the path he had chosen. The being who had begun this journey as a curious student seeking knowledge had evolved into something far more significant. a cosmic force whose influence would reshape the destiny of entire civilizations according to principles that transcended the petty moral considerations that limited lesser minds. The ritual chamber filled with energies that made the air itself seem to burn with invisible fire, as ancient machinery that had slumbered for millennia awakened to facilitate the emergence of a new Dark Lord whose power would eclipse anything that the galaxy had witnessed since the golden age of the Sith Empire itself. The galaxy trembled as two of its most promising champions embraced darkness in a convergence that would reshape the fate of countless worlds. Ulic Qel-Droma, once a beacon of Jedi virtue, had fallen to corruption through his own tragic path involving love, loss, and the seductive promises of Sith alchemy on the world of Onderon. When he encountered Exar Kun amid the ancient temples of Yavin 4, the meeting represented more than mere chance, but rather the fulfillment of cosmic forces that had been building toward this moment for generations. The initial confrontation between these two fallen Jedi occurred in the shadow of the Great Temple, where Kun had undergone his transformation, their lightsabers casting dancing shadows across hieroglyphs that seemed to pulse with approval at this convergence of dark power. Each warrior represented the pinnacle of combat prowess, enhanced by techniques that transcended normal force application, creating a battle that served not to determine victory, but rather to test the compatibility of their respective approaches to Sith mastery. The duel that followed was less a fight than a ritualistic dance, as both combatants recognized in each other the presence of power that demanded respect rather than destruction. Their blades moved with precision that bordered on prescience, each attack flowing seamlessly into defensive maneuvers that demonstrated mastery of combat forms that had been lost to conventional Jedi training for centuries. The formal establishment of their brotherhood marked the beginning of a recruitment campaign that would draw fallen Jedi and ambitious Force users from across known space. Kun's philosophical sophistication combined with Qel-Droma's military expertise created an irresistible combination that appealed to individuals who had grown disillusioned with the limitations imposed by traditional authorities. Their first major convert was Credo, a young Jedi whose natural aggression had been poorly managed by instructors who failed to understand the constructive applications of controlled anger. The conversion of Alima Keto represented a different approach to recruitment, as her natural force sensitivity had been suppressed by a noble upbringing that emphasized political manipulation over spiritual development. Kun's teachings provided her with frameworks for understanding power that transformed her from a frustrated aristocrat into a formidable practitioner of Sith sorcery, whose abilities complemented the military focus of other Brotherhood members. Each new recruit brought additional resources and capabilities to the growing organization, creating a network of influence that extended far beyond the jungle temples of Yavin 4. Sympathizers within the Jedi Order provided intelligence about potential targets and defensive preparations, while converts in governmental positions offered access to military assets and strategic information that would prove crucial in the coming conflict. The Brotherhood's approach to warfare represented a revolutionary synthesis of ancient Sith strategies with contemporary military technology, creating tactical doctrines that caught Republic forces completely unprepared for the sophistication of their opponents. Traditional defensive strategies proved inadequate against enemies who could coordinate their actions through force bonds while simultaneously employing conventional weapons with supernatural precision. Their first major campaign targeted the Empress Theta system, a wealthy industrial region whose resources would provide the economic foundation for sustained military operations. The assault combined traditional fleet tactics with Sith battle meditation techniques that allowed the attackers to maintain perfect coordination while simultaneously disrupting their opponent's ability to mount effective resistance. The psychological impact of these early victories proved as significant as their strategic value, as news of the Brotherhood's success spread throughout the galaxy, accompanied by reports of their supernatural abilities. Entire star systems began to reassess their loyalty to Republic authority as it became apparent that the traditional protectors were facing challenges that exceeded their capacity to address through conventional means. Khan's role as the intellectual leader of the movement became increasingly apparent as the conflict expanded, his philosophical frameworks providing justification for actions that might otherwise have been dismissed as mere aggression. The Brotherhood's propaganda presented their campaign not as conquest but as liberation, offering subjugated populations freedom from the constraints imposed by corrupt and incompetent authorities. The recruitment of additional Force users accelerated as success breeds success, drawing ambitious individuals who recognized that alliance with the victorious faction offered opportunities for advancement that would never be available through traditional channels. Many of these new converts brought their own followers and resources, creating an exponential expansion of the Brotherhood's capabilities that caught Republic strategists completely off guard. Kun's personal involvement in the training process ensured that new converts received instruction that emphasized intellectual development alongside martial prowess, creating adherents who understood the philosophical foundations of their cause, rather than merely following orders from charismatic leaders. The response of the Jedi Order to these developments revealed the extent to which traditional approaches were inadequate for addressing threats that operated outside conventional parameters. Council meetings became increasingly acrimonious as members debated whether to maintain their defensive posture or adopt more aggressive strategies that might compromise their fundamental principles. Master Vodo Siosk Ba emerged as one of the most vocal advocates for direct action against his former apprentice, arguing that the corruption of so many promising students represented an existential threat that required immediate and decisive response. His personal knowledge of Kun's capabilities made him uniquely qualified to assess the magnitude of the challenge facing the Order, though his emotional investment in the outcome also made his judgment suspect in the eyes of some colleagues. The strategic debates within Jedi circles were complicated by the Brotherhood's sophisticated propaganda campaign, which presented their actions as responses to Republic oppression rather than unprovoked aggression. This narrative found receptive audiences among populations who had legitimate grievances against central authority, making it difficult for traditional leaders to maintain moral authority while opposing what appeared to be popular liberation movements. The expansion of the conflict beyond military engagement to encompass ideological warfare represented one of Kun's most significant innovations, demonstrating his understanding that lasting victory required the transformation of consciousness as well as the conquest of territory. The Brotherhood's success in winning hearts and minds proved as crucial as their battlefield achievements in determining the ultimate trajectory of the war. As the Great Sith War entered its most active phase, the galaxy found itself divided, not merely between competing military forces, but between fundamentally different visions of how civilization should be organized and governed. The conflict that had begun with the fall of two promising Jedi had evolved into something far more significant than mere political rebellion, representing instead a cosmic struggle between order and chaos that would determine the fate of countless generations. The crystalline spires of Ossus pierced the morning sky like needles of pure light, their transparent surfaces refracting the rays of twin suns into rainbow patterns that danced across the greatest repository of knowledge in the known galaxy. For over 25,000 years, this world had served as the heart of Jedi learning, its vast library complexes containing the accumulated wisdom of countless civilizations alongside artifacts of power that defied conventional understanding of what was possible through force manipulation. Exar Kun's approach to this sacred world represented the culmination of his transformation from curious student to cosmic destroyer, his enhanced consciousness now capable of perceiving the intricate energy patterns that connected every holocron, crystal, and meditation chamber within the sprawling complex. The dark side energies that had reshaped his essential nature resonated with malevolent harmony against the concentrated light side influences that had been cultivated here across millennia of devoted study. The assault on Ossus was planned not merely as military conquest, but as symbolic annihilation of everything that traditional Jedi philosophy represented. Kun understood that the destruction of this irreplaceable center of learning would send shockwaves throughout the galaxy that would prove far more devastating than any number of conventional victories, striking at the psychological foundation of resistance to his expanding empire. His approach to the Academy demonstrated tactical brilliance that combined supernatural prescience with devastating practical application of advanced Sith techniques. The Jedi defenders who attempted to mount resistance discovered that their traditional training had left them completely unprepared for confrontation with abilities that operated outside the parameters of conventional force application. Kun's mastery of Sith battle meditation allowed him to coordinate his assault with supernatural precision while simultaneously disrupting his opponent's capacity for organized defense, creating chaos that multiplied the effectiveness of his relatively small strike force. Yet the true horror of the Ossus massacre was not revealed through conventional combat, but rather through Kun's demonstration of techniques that could drain the life force from multiple victims simultaneously, converting their spiritual energy into power that further enhanced his already formidable capabilities. The ancient Sith arts of force vampirism, refined through his studies and amplified by the temple energies of Yavin 4, allowed him to become stronger with each life he extinguished. The systematic destruction of the library complexes was conducted with methodical precision that revealed Kun's understanding of the psychological impact such devastation would have on survivors. He specifically targeted the most irreplaceable manuscripts and unique artifacts, ensuring that even if the physical structures could eventually be rebuilt, the accumulated knowledge of millennia would be lost forever. Among the most significant casualties of the assault was the collection of Jedi holocrons that contained the preserved teachings of the Order's greatest masters throughout history. These devices, each representing decades or centuries of accumulated wisdom, the personal confrontation between Kun and the Jedi Masters who had gathered to defend their sacred site demonstrated the extent to which his abilities now transcended normal limitations of force application. His lightsaber technique had evolved beyond mere combat prowess to become an expression of cosmic will that could reshape the battlefield itself, creating advantages that made victory inevitable regardless of his opponent's skill or numerical superiority. The resolution of this cosmic confrontation came not through direct victory, but through Kun's recognition that Udbana's sacrifice was creating a protective barrier around the most essential knowledge repositories, ensuring that some fraction of Ossus's treasures would survive for future discovery. Rather than waste additional energy attempting to penetrate these defenses, Kun chose to complete his symbolic victory through the dramatic destruction of the Academy's most visible monuments to learning. The departure from Ossus marked a psychological transformation that elevated Kun's status from successful military commander to legendary figure whose mere name would inspire terror throughout the galaxy for generations to come. The systematic annihilation of the Jedi's most sacred site demonstrated power that seemed to place him beyond the reach of conventional opposition, creating an aura of invincibility that served his strategic purposes as effectively as any weapon. Yet the true test of his evolution toward ultimate Sith mastery would come through direct confrontation with the mentor who had first guided his steps toward Force sensitivity. Master Vader Siosk Bass had tracked his former apprentice across the galaxy, driven by a combination of personal responsibility and desperate hope that some remnant of the promising young student might still exist beneath the layers of corruption that had transformed him into a cosmic threat. The meeting between master and student occurred in the ruins of an ancient temple on a world whose name had been lost to galactic memory, its crumbling architecture providing an appropriately somber backdrop for a confrontation that would determine whether love and wisdom could triumph over power and ambition. The elderly Jedi approached this encounter with full knowledge that he was probably facing his own death, yet unable to abandon the duty he felt toward both his former apprentice and the galaxy that Kun threatened to consume. Their conversation before the inevitable duel revealed the complete philosophical chasm that now separated them, as Kun explained his cosmic vision with the passionate eloquence of a being who had transcended normal limitations of perspective and understanding. His arguments possessed a terrible logic that made his conclusions seem almost inevitable, demonstrating how even the most destructive actions could be justified through sufficiently sophisticated reasoning. Master Bast listened to these explanations with the patient sadness of someone witnessing the corruption of infinite potential, recognizing in his former student's words the echoes of questions and concerns that had once represented genuine intellectual curiosity rather than justifications for atrocity. The lightsaber duel that followed was less a battle than a ritual, as both participants understood that the outcome had been determined long before their blades ever crossed. Kun's abilities had grown far beyond anything that conventional Jedi training could hope to counter, while Bast's advanced age and emotional turmoil made it impossible for him to access the full extent of his own considerable powers. Yet, the elderly master's final moments revealed the ultimate limitation of Kun's transformation, as Baz demonstrated that there remained aspects of Force mastery that could not be achieved through power alone. His willing sacrifice created ripples in the cosmic force that would influence events far beyond his immediate death, planting seeds of eventual redemption that would take generations to bear fruit. The death of Vodo Siosk Baz marked a symbolic completion of Kun's journey from light to darkness, severing his final connection to the person he had once been, and leaving him free to pursue his cosmic ambitions without the burden of nostalgic sentiment. The galaxy now faced a threat that was truly unlimited by conventional moral constraints, a being whose power was matched only by his complete conviction in the righteousness of his cause. The green hell of Yavin 4 had become the epicenter of a cosmic storm that threatened to consume the entire galaxy. As Republic fleets converged on the jungle moon in the largest coordinated military operation in recorded history, every available warship had been diverted to this final assault, their combined firepower representing the last desperate hope of preventing Exar Kun from completing the ultimate ritual that would transform him into an entity of pure dark side energy, capable of imposing his will across unlimited distances. The ancient Massassi temples that had served as Kun's stronghold pulsed with malevolent energy that made the very atmosphere around them shimmer with barely contained power, creating distortions in local space-time that interfered with both sensor equipment and navigation systems aboard the approaching Republic vessels. The jungle itself seemed to writhe with hostile intent, as if the planetary ecosystem had been corrupted by prolonged exposure to concentrated Sith energies. Within the primary temple complex, Kun prepared for the most ambitious application of force manipulation ever attempted by any being in galactic history. The ritual he was about to perform would require him to sacrifice the life force of every Massassi warrior on the planet, converting their spiritual energy into power that would allow his consciousness to transcend physical existence while retaining the ability to influence material reality through will alone. The degenerate descendants of the original temple builders had been gathering for days in response to compulsions that operated below the level of conscious thought, their primitive minds, unable to comprehend the true nature of their purpose, but nevertheless driven by genetic programming that had been embedded in their species millennia earlier. They filled the vast ceremonial chambers with their presence, creating a living battery of force-sensitive beings whose sacrifice would fuel Kun's transformation into something beyond mortality. The Republic fleet's orbital bombardment commenced at the precise moment when the jungle moon's position relative to the gas giant Yavin created optimal conditions for the ritual, sending cascades of turbo-laser fire down through the atmosphere in an attempt to disrupt the ceremony before it could reach completion. The ancient stone structures proved remarkably resistant to conventional weapons, their crystalline foundations redirecting and absorbing energy in ways that suggested they had been specifically designed to withstand such attacks. Admiral Thorn Dodonna, commanding the Republic forces from his position aboard the flagship, watched with growing horror as his most powerful weapons proved ineffective against targets that should have been reduced to rubble within minutes of sustained bombardment. The temples seemed to grow stronger with each impact, their hieroglyphic inscriptions beginning to glow with inner fire as they channeled the incoming energy into systems that had been dormant since their original construction. On the surface, Jedi strike teams that had been inserted during the initial phases of the assault found themselves facing opposition that transcended normal understanding of what was possible through force application. The jungle itself had become Khorne's ally, with plant life and native creatures twisted into instruments of his will through applications of Sith alchemy that violated every natural law governing the relationship between consciousness and matter. Master Nomi Sunrider led the most elite team of surviving Jedi in a desperate attempt to penetrate the primary temple and disrupt the ritual through direct action, her natural ability to sever force connections, representing the only known counter to the binding techniques that Kun was employing. Yet even her exceptional gifts proved inadequate against defenses that had been prepared by someone whose understanding of force manipulation now exceeded anything that conventional training could hope to achieve. The ritual itself had progressed beyond the point where physical intervention could prevent its completion, as Kun began the systematic drainage of life force from thousands of Massassi warriors whose consciousness was being absorbed into his expanding spiritual matrix. Their death screams created harmonics that resonated through the temple crystals, amplifying the dark side energies being generated to levels that made reality itself seem to bend around the focal point of the ceremony. The transformation that Kun underwent during these final moments represented the culmination of everything he had studied and practiced since his first exposure to forbidden knowledge years earlier. His physical form began to dissolve as his consciousness expanded beyond the limitations of material existence, becoming something that was simultaneously everywhere and nowhere within the temple complex. Yet even as he achieved the transcendence he had sought, Kun discovered that the price of his transformation was far greater than he had anticipated. The binding of his consciousness to the temple crystals created a form of immortality that was indistinguishable from imprisonment, trapping his enhanced awareness within the confines of structures that could channel his power, but also constrained his ability to project influence beyond their physical boundaries. The Jedi forces, recognizing that conventional assault had failed to prevent the ritual's completion, implemented a desperate final strategy that represented the collective wisdom of their entire order. Rather than attempting to destroy Kun's power through direct confrontation, they chose to contain it through the creation of a light-side barrier that would prevent his influence from extending beyond the immediate vicinity of the temples. This massive, coordinated effort required every surviving Jedi to contribute their strength to a technique that had never been attempted on such a scale, linking their consciousness together in a network that could channel the combined power of the light side against the concentrated darkness that Kun had become. The strain of maintaining such a connection pushed many participants beyond their physical limits, but their sacrifice created a prison of energy that proved capable of containing even Kun's transcendent abilities. The moment of final containment was marked by a psychic scream that echoed across the galaxy, as Kun's consciousness realized the true nature of his situation and raged against the barriers that now defined the extent of his influence. The ancient temples shuddered under the impact of his fury, their crystal matrices cracking but holding as they channeled his power in endless loops that prevented it from reaching beyond their architectural boundaries. The Republic fleet maintained its bombardment throughout this psychic battle, not in hope of destroying the temples, but rather to ensure that any weakening of the Jedi containment would be met with immediate physical destruction of the structures that served as Kun's anchor points. The coordination between orbital forces and ground-based force users represented an unprecedented level of cooperation between military and mystical approaches to warfare. As the immediate crisis passed and it became apparent that the containment had succeeded, the surviving participants began to comprehend the magnitude of what they had accomplished and what it had cost. The Great Sith War was effectively over, but victory had been purchased through sacrifices that would leave lasting scars on both the Jedi Order and the Republic itself. The jungle moon fell silent as the last echoes of battle faded, leaving only the whisper of wind through corrupted vegetation and the barely audible hum of energy fields that marked the boundaries of Kun's prison. Within the temples, an intelligence that had once been human continued to exist in a state that was neither life nor death, possessed of godlike power, but unable to exercise it beyond the stone walls that had become both his monument and his tomb. The Republic forces began their withdrawal, knowing that they had witnessed the end of an era, the final confrontation between light and darkness that had shaped galactic civilization for generations. Yet they also understood that their victory was incomplete, that the entity they had contained rather than destroyed would remain a potential threat for as long as the temples continued to exist. In the depths of the primary pyramid, Exar Kun's consciousness settled into patterns that would define his existence for millennia to come, his enhanced awareness exploring every detail of his crystalline prison while calculating possibilities for eventual escape. The student who had sought knowledge above all else had achieved a form of ultimate understanding, gaining complete comprehension of his situation while losing forever the ability to change it. The ancient Masasi, who had been sacrificed to fuel his transformation, existed now only as energy patterns within the temple matrices, their life force converted into the power source that sustained Kun's continued existence. Their primitive consciousness had been absorbed into his expanded awareness, creating an ironic unity between the beings who had built his prison and the entity they now served to maintain. As Yavin 4 settled into its new role as the tomb of the last great Sith Lord, the galaxy began the long process of healing from wounds that would take generations to fully mend. The knowledge that such power could exist, and the memory of how close it had come to achieving ultimate victory, would haunt the survivors and shape the policies of future governments for centuries to come. The silence that descended upon Yavin 4 following the great battle carried within it a quality that transcended mere absence of sound, creating an atmosphere of suspension where time itself seemed to move differently than in the rest of the galaxy. Within the crystalline heart of the primary temple, Exar Kun's consciousness existed in a state that defied conventional understanding of life and death, aware of every passing moment yet powerless to influence events beyond the stone boundaries that had become his eternal domain. The nature of his imprisonment was far more sophisticated than simple physical containment, representing instead a form of spiritual bondage that utilized his own enhanced abilities against him. The same force techniques that had elevated him beyond mortal limitations now served to anchor his consciousness within the temple matrices, creating feedback loops that made escape attempts only strengthen the bonds that held him captive. His expanded awareness could perceive the intricate energy patterns that maintained his prison with perfect clarity, understanding exactly how the light side barriers functioned while remaining unable to overcome them through any application of his considerable power. The Jedi who had crafted this containment had demonstrated wisdom that matched their strength, creating a solution that turned Kun's greatest assets into the instruments of his own defeat. The passing of years brought no relief from the crushing weight of absolute knowledge combined with absolute powerlessness, as Kun's superhuman intellect was forced to contemplate every detail of his situation without hope of meaningful change. The same analytical abilities that had once allowed him to unlock the secrets of ancient Sith techniques now tormented him with perfect understanding of the logical impossibility of his escape. Decades accumulated into centuries as the jungle gradually reclaimed portions of the temple complex, vegetation growing through cracks in stone that had been damaged during the final battle. Kun could sense every root that penetrated his domain, every leaf that fell within the sphere of his influence, yet remained incapable of affecting these natural processes in any meaningful way. The occasional arrival of explorers and treasure hunters provided brief respites from the monotony of solitary existence, their presence offering glimpses of the changing galaxy beyond his prison. Through these unwitting visitors, Kun learned of the Republic's slow recovery from the devastation of the Great Sith War and the emergence of new conflicts that arose to fill the void left by his defeat. Some of these intruders possessed sufficient Force sensitivity to detect traces of his presence, experiencing visions or emotional influences that hinted at the vast intelligence trapped within the ancient structures. Yet even the most receptive minds proved inadequate vehicles for meaningful communication, lacking the spiritual development necessary to sustain direct contact with consciousness that had been transformed beyond normal human parameters. The most significant of these encounters occurred when young Jedi would occasionally arrive to study the historical significance of the temple complex, their light side training providing natural resistance to his influence, while simultaneously making them capable of perceiving his existence. These interactions allowed Kun to observe the evolution of Jedi philosophy across generations, noting how the trauma of the Great Sith War had shaped their approach to training and their understanding of the dangers posed by forbidden knowledge. Through these observations, he began to recognize patterns in the way Force users developed their abilities, identifying recurring weaknesses and vulnerabilities that could potentially be exploited by someone with sufficient patience and subtlety. The knowledge that future opportunities might arise provided the only source of hope in an existence otherwise characterized by absolute frustration and impotent rage. The temple crystals that served as both his power source and his prison continued to pulse with energy that resonated through dimensions beyond normal space-time, creating ripples in the Force that occasionally attracted the attention of dark side practitioners throughout the galaxy. These distant connections were too weak to facilitate actual communication, but they served to remind Kun that his influence had not been completely eliminated from the cosmic order. The gradual deterioration of the containment barriers represented the most significant change in his circumstances across the centuries, as the Jedi who had created them aged and died without passing on complete knowledge of their maintenance requirements. Each generation of Guardians possessed slightly less understanding of the original techniques, leading to subtle weaknesses that accumulated over time like hairline fractures in seemingly solid stone. Khajiin's superhuman patience allowed him to catalog every minute variation in the energy patterns that defined his prison, building a comprehensive understanding of how the barriers functioned and where they might eventually fail. The knowledge that his containment was not permanent provided a psychological anchor that prevented complete despair from overwhelming his transformed consciousness. Even if escape required millennia rather than years, the certainty that eventual freedom was theoretically possible allowed him to maintain the mental discipline necessary for long-term planning on scales that normal minds could barely comprehend. His study of the prison mechanics revealed that the barriers drew their power from the natural light-side energies present in all living things, creating a dependency on the continued existence of Force-sensitive life throughout the galaxy. Any significant disruption to this cosmic balance would weaken the containment proportionally, suggesting that future galactic catastrophes might provide opportunities for escape that careful preparation could exploit. The realization that his freedom might depend on the suffering of others provided a source of dark satisfaction that helped sustain his sanity across the empty centuries. The Jedi who had imprisoned him had inadvertently created a situation where their own principles would eventually work against them, as their commitment to preserving life would ultimately contribute to the restoration of their greatest enemy. The temple complex became a repository of concentrated malevolence that influenced the planetary ecosystem in subtle ways, creating mutations in local flora and fauna that reflected the corrupting presence at the heart of the ancient structures. These changes were too gradual to be noticed by casual observers, but they represented tangible evidence that Kun's power continued to affect the physical world despite the barriers that constrained his direct influence. The absorption of Massassi consciousness had provided him with genetic memories that stretched back to the original construction of the temples, revealing techniques and knowledge that had been lost even to the Sith Lords who had employed their descendants. This information included maintenance procedures for the crystalline matrix systems and theoretical applications of temple technology that its builders had never implemented. Among the most significant of these discoveries was the recognition that the temple complex had been designed as more than a mere fortress or meditation facility, representing instead a sophisticated machine for manipulating the fundamental forces that govern space and time. The full activation of these systems would require power levels that exceeded even Kun's enhanced capabilities, but the theoretical possibility suggested applications that could reshape reality on galactic scales. The knowledge that such potential existed within his prison added layers of irony to his situation, as he possessed complete understanding of techniques that could grant him godlike power, while remaining unable to access the resources necessary for their implementation. The temple builders had created the ultimate weapon and simultaneously ensured that it could never be used by anyone lacking the wisdom to employ it responsibly. As his imprisonment entered its 4th century, Kun began to detect subtle changes in the cosmic force that suggested the approach of significant events beyond his immediate sphere of influence. The most intriguing of these disturbances involved the emergence of Force users whose power levels approached those that had characterized the Golden Age of both Jedi and Sith, suggesting that the galaxy was entering another period of cosmic significance that might reshape the fundamental balance between light and darkness. The possibility that such individuals might eventually find their way to Yavin 4 provided hope that had sustained him through centuries of absolute isolation. The eternal nature of his punishment had become a source of terrible wisdom, as unlimited time for contemplation had allowed him to achieve understanding of cosmic principles that remained hidden from beings constrained by normal lifespans. This knowledge represented both his greatest treasure and his most exquisite torture, providing him with insights that could transform galactic civilization while leaving him powerless to apply them in any meaningful way. 4,000 years after his imprisonment began, the cosmos stirred with familiar patterns that resonated through the Force like echoes of ancient melodies long thought forgotten. The emergence of Luke Skywalker as a Jedi Master had created ripples in the galactic consciousness that penetrated even the crystalline barriers surrounding Exar Kun's trapped awareness, bringing news of developments that rekindled ambitions that centuries of solitude had refined rather than diminished. The establishment of a new Jedi Academy on Yavin 4 represented an opportunity that exceeded even Kun's most optimistic projections, as the presence of Force-sensitive students within his sphere of influence provided potential vessels for the consciousness transfer techniques he had spent centuries perfecting in theoretical isolation. These young minds, eager for knowledge and lacking the experienced defenses of fully trained Jedi, offered possibilities for escape that justified the patience he had exercised across millennia of captivity. Luke's choice of location for his training facility demonstrated either remarkable ignorance of galactic history or dangerous overconfidence in his ability to contain threats that had overwhelmed far more experienced Jedi in previous generations. The temples that housed his students pulsed with the same dark energies that had corrupted countless beings throughout history, creating an environment where even well-intentioned instruction could become a pathway to corruption for those whose moral foundations lacked sufficient depth. The first students to arrive at the academy possessed varying degrees of natural ability and psychological resilience, providing Kun with a selection of potential targets whose vulnerabilities could be assessed and exploited through careful observation. His enhanced perception allowed him to analyze their emotional states and intellectual capabilities with precision that made conventional psychological evaluation seem primitive by comparison. Among the most promising candidates was Gantoris, a young man whose natural force sensitivity had been shaped by experiences of leadership and survival that had created a personality structure particularly receptive to arguments, emphasizing strength and decisive action. The process of making contact with selected students required Kun to extend his consciousness beyond the normal boundaries of his prison through applications of technique that pushed the limits of what his containment could accommodate. These efforts weakened the barriers that held him, but did not immediately compromise their integrity, creating a calculated risk that offered potential rewards far exceeding the dangers involved. His initial communications took the form of dreams and visions that appeared to originate from the students' own subconscious minds, making them difficult to dismiss as external influences, while simultaneously planting concepts that would gradually reshape their understanding of force application. The effectiveness of this approach depended on its subtlety, as direct commands would have triggered resistance while gentle suggestions could be accepted as personal insights. The construction of a lightsaber became the focus of Kun's first major influence attempt, as he guided Gantoris through the creation of a weapon that incorporated design elements drawn from ancient Sith traditions. Luke's inability to recognize the signs of his students' growing corruption revealed the limitations of training that emphasized personal discovery over systematic instruction in the specific techniques used by dark side practitioners to influence susceptible minds. The new Jedi Master's well-intentioned approach to education created opportunities for subversion that more experienced instructors would have anticipated and prevented. The success of his initial influence attempts encouraged Kun to expand his efforts to encompass additional students, each of whom presented unique challenges that required customized approaches based on their individual psychological profiles. The diversity of backgrounds and motivations among the Academy's population provided him with extensive opportunities to refine persuasion techniques that had remained theoretical during his long isolation. The corruption of Keep required more sophisticated methods than had been necessary for Gantoris, as his closer relationship with Luke created additional obstacles that needed to be overcome through indirect influence rather than direct persuasion. Cole's approach emphasized the development of abilities that exceeded conventional Jedi training, while simultaneously fostering attitudes that would make their responsible use according to traditional principles seem inadequate for addressing genuine threats. The demonstration of advanced techniques through Kip's enhanced capabilities served multiple purposes, validating Kun's teachings while simultaneously undermining confidence in conventional approaches to force application. The young man's rapid development created a visible example of what could be achieved through methods that transcended the limitations imposed by conservative training philosophies. The destruction of Imperial installations using techniques that combined traditional Jedi abilities with applications drawn from Sith traditions provided concrete evidence of the effectiveness of Kun's approach, while simultaneously creating psychological pressure for other students to seek similar enhancement of their own capabilities. The success of these operations made it difficult for Luke to criticize methods that achieved results his own teachings had been unable to produce. Yet even as his influence expanded throughout the Academy, Kun recognized that his ultimate goal of achieving physical escape would require more than mere corruption of individual students. The weakening of his prison barriers demanded applications of power that could only be sustained through the complete conversion of multiple force users whose combined spiritual energy could fuel the techniques necessary for breaking free from crystalline containment. The process of escalating his influence from subtle suggestion to direct control represented the most dangerous phase of his escape attempt, as it would inevitably attract Luke's attention while simultaneously depleting the energy reserves that maintained his consciousness across the centuries. The timing of this final gambit would need to be perfect, allowing him to achieve freedom before the Academy's defenses could be organized effectively. The confrontation that would determine his fate began when Luke finally recognized the true source of the corruption affecting his students, leading to a direct psychic battle between the imprisoned Sith Lord and the last representative of traditional Jedi training. This struggle transcended mere personal conflict to become a test of competing philosophies about the nature of power and responsibility. Kun's centuries of preparation proved inadequate against Luke's intuitive understanding of Force principles that operated beyond conventional techniques, as the younger Jedi demonstrated abilities that drew upon sources of strength that remained inaccessible to beings whose connection to the light side had been permanently severed. The battle revealed fundamental limitations in Sith philosophy that no amount of accumulated knowledge could overcome. The intervention of other Jedi spirits, including the restored consciousness of Luke's own masters, created a coalition of light side energy that overwhelmed even Kun's enhanced capabilities, while simultaneously providing his opponents with tactical advantages based on collective wisdom rather than individual power. This demonstration of cooperative strength proved decisive in determining the outcome of their confrontation. The final destruction of Kun's spiritual anchors within the temple crystals marked the end of an era that had begun with a curious student's innocent questions about the nature of forbidden knowledge. His consciousness, no longer sustained by the artificial matrices that had preserved it for millennia, finally experienced the dissolution that had been delayed rather than prevented by his transformation into a creature of pure dark side energy. The Academy's survival and the restoration of its students to balanced understanding represented a victory for principles that emphasized growth through wisdom rather than power, demonstrating that even the most sophisticated corruption could be overcome through the application of genuine understanding combined with collective effort. The legacy of Exar Kun's influence would continue to serve as a cautionary example for future generations of Force users. The jungle moon settled once again into peaceful patterns of natural growth and decay, its ancient temples now serving as monuments to both the dangers of unchecked ambition and the ultimate triumph of wisdom over power. The stories told by the surviving students would ensure that the lessons learned through this confrontation would be preserved for the benefit of those who would face similar temptations in generations to come. The final dissolution of Exar Kun's consciousness marked not an ending, but rather a transformation of his story from active threat to eternal teaching, as the galaxy began the slow process of understanding what his rise and fall revealed about the fundamental nature of power, knowledge. In the years following the Academy crisis, scholars and historians began to piece together a more complete understanding of Kun's journey from promising student to cosmic destroyer, recognizing patterns that had been invisible to those living through the events as they unfolded. The careful analysis of surviving records revealed the subtle stages through which corruption had progressed, providing insights that would prove invaluable for identifying and preventing similar tragedies in future generations. The psychological profile that emerged from these studies painted a picture of exceptional ability, combined with fatal character flaws that had made Kun's fall almost inevitable once he began his descent into forbidden knowledge. His intellectual brilliance had become a weakness when divorced from the humility necessary for genuine wisdom, creating a feedback loop where each success reinforced his conviction that conventional limitations did not apply to someone of his capabilities. The role of mentorship in shaping Force users became a central focus of academic discussion, as Master Vodosios Gbaz's relationship with his fallen apprentice provided a case study in the delicate balance between nurturing potential and maintaining appropriate boundaries. The elderly Jedi's genuine affection for Kun had blinded him to warning signs that a more detached observer might have recognized, demonstrating how emotional investment could compromise professional judgment even among the most experienced teachers. The institutional failures that had enabled Kun's access to dangerous knowledge revealed systematic weaknesses in the way the Jedi Order approached the preservation and dissemination of historical information. The policy of restricting rather than contextualizing dangerous texts had created an atmosphere of mystery that made forbidden knowledge more attractive rather than less, appealing to naturally curious minds that might have been satisfied with complete information presented in appropriate educational frameworks. The broader galactic context within which Kun's transformation had occurred suggested that his emergence as a dark side practitioner was not purely coincidental, but rather reflected cosmic forces that periodically created conditions favorable for the rise of individuals capable of reshaping civilizations according to their personal vision. These cyclical patterns implied that similar threats would continue to emerge regardless of specific preventive measures, making ongoing vigilance a permanent necessity rather than a temporary response to immediate danger. The study of Kun's philosophical development revealed how rational argumentation could be used to justify increasingly extreme positions through incremental steps that seemed logical when viewed in isolation, but collectively led to conclusions that contradicted fundamental moral principles. His intellectual framework had provided sophisticated justifications for actions that were obviously wrong when evaluated according to basic ethical standards, demonstrating the danger of theoretical systems that prioritized consistency over practical consequences. The comparative analysis of Kun's methods with those employed by other historical Sith Lords revealed both similarities and unique innovations that reflected his particular background and capabilities. His emphasis on intellectual seduction rather than crude emotional manipulation had made him more effective at corrupting educated targets, while simultaneously making his influence more difficult to detect, until corruption had progressed beyond the point where intervention was possible. The technological and architectural achievements associated with Kun's period of activity provided evidence of capabilities that seemed to transcend normal understanding of what was possible through force application alone. The temple complexes on Yavin 4 incorporated engineering principles that remained incomprehensible to contemporary scientists, suggesting that dark-side techniques could unlock forms of knowledge that were inaccessible through conventional research methods. The implications of these discoveries raised troubling questions about the relationship between power and wisdom that continued to challenge philosophers and theologians long after Kun's destruction. If the dark side could provide access to genuine insights about the nature of reality, then the traditional Jedi emphasis on rejecting such knowledge might represent a form of willful ignorance that ultimately weakened their ability to protect the galaxy from threats requiring comprehensive understanding. The psychological impact of Kun's story on subsequent generations of Force users created both beneficial and problematic effects that shaped the development of Jedi training for centuries following his defeat. The awareness of how easily exceptional students could be corrupted led to increased emphasis on emotional stability and moral grounding. But it also fostered an atmosphere of suspicion that discouraged the kind of intellectual boldness that had historically produced the Order's greatest innovations. The survivors of the Academy crisis carried with them direct experience of how seductive dark-side influence could be, providing them with understanding that could not be acquired through theoretical study alone. Their testimonies became essential components of educational programs designed to prepare future Jedi for the psychological challenges they would face when confronted with similar temptations. The gradual recognition that Kun's transformation had been shaped as much by institutional failures as by personal choices led to significant reforms in how the Jedi Order approached both education and the preservation of dangerous knowledge. These changes reflected hard-won wisdom about the importance of transparency and trust in maintaining the psychological health of individuals whose exceptional abilities made them potential targets for corruption. The broader cultural impact of Kun's story extended far beyond the Jedi Order to influence political and social institutions throughout the galaxy, as populations that had witnessed the devastation caused by unchecked power became more vigilant about the concentration of authority in the hands of individuals lacking appropriate oversight. The memory of the Great Sith War served as a permanent reminder of what could happen when exceptional ability was combined with insufficient accountability. The philosophical legacy of Kun's rise and fall continued to generate debate about fundamental questions regarding the nature of good and evil, the proper relationship between individual ambition and collective welfare, and the extent to which extraordinary circumstances might justify extraordinary methods. These discussions revealed the complexity of moral reasoning in situations where traditional ethical frameworks provided inadequate guidance for addressing unprecedented challenges. The recognition that Kun's story represented not an isolated incident, but rather one example of recurring patterns in galactic history, led to increased interest in comparative studies of similar figures from different eras and cultures. These investigations revealed common elements in the psychological profiles of individuals who achieved great power through questionable means, providing insights that could potentially be used to identify and redirect such individuals before their ambitions became destructive. The ultimate lesson that emerged from careful analysis of Kun's complete story was not that exceptional individuals were inherently dangerous, but rather that exceptional ability created exceptional responsibility that required exceptional wisdom to manage appropriately. The tragedy was not that Kun had possessed great power, but that he had never learned to use it in service of purposes greater than his own desires for knowledge and control. The peaceful jungle that now covered the ruins of his temples served as a living metaphor for the galaxy's capacity to heal from even the most devastating wounds, while the preserved stones beneath the vegetation ensured that the memory of what had occurred would remain available for those wise enough to learn from the mistakes of previous generations. In death, Exar Kun had achieved a form of immortality more lasting than anything his living ambitions could have provided, becoming a permanent part of the wisdom that would guide future choices between light and darkness. The gas giant Yavin drifts in eternal silence through the void between stars, its massive form casting shadows across the small worlds that dance in orbital patterns unchanged since the galaxy was young. The fourth moon, once the epicenter of cosmic struggle between light and darkness, now rests in tranquil harmony with natural cycles that have reclaimed the ancient stones and transformed monuments to ambition into gardens where life flourishes without the burden of conscious design or deliberate purpose. Beneath canopies of emerald leaves that filter starlight into gentle patterns of silver and shadow, the jungle breathes with rhythms that speak of patience beyond mortal understanding. The temples that once channeled the raw power of the dark side have become part of the living landscape, their crystalline hearts now serving as focal points for energies that nurture rather than corrupt, supporting ecosystems where predator and prey exist in balance that requires no external intervention to maintain. The story of Exar Kun has joined the vast library of galactic memory, taking its place among countless other tales of rise and fall that collectively form the wisdom tradition passed from generation to generation. His name is spoken now, not with fear, but with the solemn recognition due to any teacher whose lessons were purchased at great cost, reminding those who would follow similar paths of destinations that await the unwary traveler who mistakes power for wisdom. In meditation halls throughout the galaxy, young Force users learn to recognize the subtle signs of corruption that begin with innocent questions and noble intentions, understanding through his example how easily the pursuit of knowledge can become the pursuit of dominance when divorced from humility and compassion. The Jedi archives preserve complete records of his transformation alongside detailed analysis of the institutional failures that enabled his access to dangerous knowledge, creating educational resources that serve multiple purposes in preventing similar tragedies. These materials are presented not as forbidden secrets, but as essential understanding for anyone whose responsibilities might bring them into contact with the subtle influences that shape the boundary between service and selfishness. The academic study of his philosophical development has contributed to broader understanding of how rational beings can convince themselves that destructive actions serve beneficial purposes, providing insights that extend far beyond Force training to encompass political science, psychology, and ethics. His logical frameworks continue to serve as examples of sophisticated reasoning applied to fundamentally flawed premises, demonstrating the importance of examining foundational assumptions rather than merely evaluating the consistency of conclusions. The worlds that suffered during the Great Sith War have long since recovered from the physical devastation of that conflict, their populations now living in peace that takes security for granted in the way that only those who have never experienced true catastrophe can manage. Yet in their cultural traditions persist stories and songs that keep alive the memory of what unchecked ambition can cost, ensuring that vigilance remains a living tradition rather than mere historical curiosity. The Massassi who once served as unwilling sacrifices for Kun's ultimate transformation exist now only in genetic traces scattered throughout the galactic population, their distinctive features occasionally surfacing in descendants who carry forward the biological legacy of a species that paid the ultimate price for proximity to unlimited power. These physical remnants serve as quiet reminders that the cost of cosmic ambition is typically borne not by those who pursue it, but by those who lack the strength to resist its influence. The Force itself flows more peacefully through the regions once disrupted by concentrated applications of dark side energy, as if the cosmos has gradually healed from wounds that temporarily distorted the natural patterns connecting all living things. The balance between light and darkness continues its eternal dance on scales that dwarf individual lives and civilizations, maintaining equilibrium through processes that operate beyond the reach of any single consciousness regardless of its power or ambition. The night sky above the ancient temples displays constellations that have shifted since the height of Kun's power, their slow movement across cosmic distances serving as a reminder that even the seemingly eternal features of existence are subject to change. When viewed from sufficiently broad perspectives, the stars that witnessed his rise and fall continue their journeys through space, carrying light to worlds that will face their own versions of the eternal struggle between wisdom and ambition. The wind that moves through the abandoned temple corridors carries no trace of the malevolent energies that once made this place feared throughout the galaxy, its gentle whispers speaking only of leaves, turning with the seasons, and small creatures going about the business of survival, without concern for the grand purposes that once made these stones shake with barely contained power. The acoustic properties that once amplified ritual chants now serve to carry bird song and the rustle of growing things. In the deepest chambers where Kun's consciousness was finally dissolved, crystals that once focused the dark side of the Force now catch and scatter ordinary sunlight in rainbow patterns that dance across walls carved with hieroglyphs whose meaning has become purely decorative. The sophisticated technology that enabled his transformation into a being of pure energy has become archaeology, its secrets preserved in academic databases where they serve educational rather than practical purposes. The eternal cycles that govern the flow of cosmic energy continue their ancient patterns, drawing power from sources that transcend individual ambition while distributing it, according to laws that no single being can hope to manipulate for personal advantage. The dark side techniques that seem to offer shortcuts to unlimited influence have revealed themselves to be temporary disruptions in processes that ultimately restore balance through methods that operate beyond the reach of conscious control. The meditation gardens that have grown around the temple ruins provide spaces where contemporary Force users can practice their disciplines in surroundings that embody the ultimate triumph of life over death, growth over destruction, and patience over urgency. The same soil that once absorbed the life force of sacrificed Massassi warriors now nourishes flowers whose beauty exists for no purpose beyond its own expression. The gentle darkness that surrounds Yavin 4 as it completes another orbit around its massive primary offers the perfect accompaniment to rest. In this tranquil setting where ambition has been transformed into wisdom and power has yielded to peace, we can find the rest that comes from understanding our place within patterns greater than ourselves. The saga of Exar Kun, like all the greatest stories, reminds us that every ending is also a beginning, every conclusion an invitation to deeper understanding of the eternal mysteries that shape our journey through the cosmos. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of one of the galaxy's most profound tales. If you found value in this deep dive into Star Wars lore, please consider subscribing to continue our journey through the ancient mysteries and forgotten legends that populate this beloved universe. Until we meet again among the stars, may you find the peace that comes from wisdom earned through understanding rather than power pursued through ambition. Sweet dreams, fellow travelers. The galaxy is vast, and there are always more stories waiting to be told.